Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to the programme. So another day, another announcement from Keir Starmer's government, this time on defence. There's to be another major defence review. I say another because we've had several of these in recent years. On the money, Keir Starmer says that he's already promised to spend 2.5% of national income on defence. That's up from about 2.3% at the moment, though we don't have a timeline for that yet. PM has committed, though, to publishing a roadmap outlining how we'll get there. So we're going to soon get a roadmap of how we get to the amount of money, but we don't quite know what it's going to set out yet. Our political editor, Alex Wickham, was on board the flight to NATO when Starmer broke with precedent and asked if Ukraine could use British missiles to strike targets in Russia. He said they were Ukraine's to use in their own self-defence.
Well, Ukraine may be the immediate threat, but the prospect of a second Trump White House is also a major catalyst. Trump loomed over that NATO gathering in DC, posting to his Truth social network as the summit began that when he had started as president, most NATO members were, quote, delinquent until they paid up due to his pressure. And that really is true. At the end of Trump's presidency, 4 more NATO countries had hit the alliance's guidelines of spending 2% of national income on defence. And then so far under President Biden's term, another 13 countries have reached that target. So there you see the kind of impact of his words. Trump's pick of J.D. Vance as his running mate now suggests also quite a doubling down on Trumpian foreign policy. Vance has promoted Trump's America First policy. He did that, for example, at the Munich Security Conference that took place just in February, insisting that European countries have to shoulder more responsibility for military spending, especially on manufacturing.
And so to this review here in the UK, the government's calling it a root and branch review. We've seen 2 integrated reviews, one in 2021 under Boris Johnson, and then we had the update, they called it a refresh in 2023 under Rishi Sunak. And remember, he called China an epoch-defining challenge rather than using the word threat. Now, Keir Starmer's review is going to be overseen by Defence Secretary John Healey and led by former NATO Secretary General George Roberson. Remember him. Lord Roberson's already said the UK and its allies face a deadly quartet of nations operating together in the shape of China, Russia, Iran and North Korea.
So our guest today is Ed Arnold, who is Senior Research Fellow in European Security at RUSI. This is the think tank, the Royal United Services Institute. Ed, welcome to the programme. Defence spending is clearly far more important now than it has been in recent decades, maybe. Do you think that this review will tell us anything that we don't already know about the armed forces in Britain?
I think in terms of reference, it will probably start to look at some issues that we don't already know and sort of probably the scale of the challenge. But equally, there are certain things that are already pretty clear, and they have been pretty clear. I just heard that you were mentioning the fact that there has been a Defence Command paper in 2021 and also a refresh in 2023. So I think the key areas where we need to focus are probably well known. I think overall the current approach of the new government is saying, though, in terms of overall defence spending, we really need to understand a little bit more, because it's not necessarily, I think we all realise that the UK forces probably need more money, but equally, due to poor procurement, etc., over the last couple of decades, have also wasted a lot of money. So from a Treasury perspective, it would be difficult to just suddenly increase without sort of trying to fix some of those problems to make sure that you get value for money.
Ed, just taking a step back a bit, what in your view are the key threats facing the UK at the moment?
Well, I think the main threat is Russia, and that will be absolutely consistent with the previous integrated review. But as Lord Roberson said, I think the real change from when that was done is what he's referring to as the deadly quartet. So actually the analysis is more going to be is how Russia interacts with the People's Republic of China, with Iran, and also particularly North Korea and other sort of nations across the world in terms of political support. And I think one of the real changes now that we saw at the NATO Washington summit last week is that the PRC is now declared as a decisive enabler. So in terms of, where we were previously defining challenge, I think the NATO language is very, very much more forward-leaning on the threat potentially posed by China, and the UK government will want to reflect that and understand what it means for UK policy.
Yeah, absolutely. A concern that perhaps those countries are sharing, supporting each other in terms of weaponry. I mean, something, for example, that China has denied. Look, on the actual figures for the UK, defence spending is currently in the region of 2.3% of GDP. Would 2.5%, in your view, actually make a tangible difference to our defence capabilities?
Yeah, yes, it will. I mean, it will make a difference, bearing in mind where UK forces are, which I think is mirrored across most European forces as well. The fact that the primary issue at the moment is readiness, so the readiness to fight a high-scale war, and one of those real limiting factors of that is actually stocks of ammunition, as an example, partly because we didn't have enough to begin with, and partly because we've provided a lot to Ukraine, and that requirement's going to continue. So sort of cash injections to the defence budget will rapidly improve readiness, provided that money is spent exactly where it needs to be. But the issue really is, I mean, because we don't have that full element of data, and this is what the review's trying to do, that it's easy to say sort of 2% because that's a NATO baseline, and 2.5%, say 3%. Well, I think when you speak to people within NATO who run, the NATO defence planning process, and their overall assumption is that even 2.5%, if the whole of the alliance was to move to 2.5%, probably wouldn't be enough, bearing in mind the threat.
On that issue of manufacturing capacity, a number of European countries have sounded the alarm about our lack of ability to make all this defence equipment. What's your assessment of the real-world capacity of the UK and Europe to build all these things?
It's been improving, but I think rather slowly, considering the challenges ahead, and it's quite difficult to assess it overall, because in some areas it has dramatically improved. In others, it kind of hasn't as much, and it still remains a bit sticky because your national industries get involved, and also private companies, who have to deliver for their shareholders. So it's actually quite difficult on cooperation, and Europe's been famously sort of difficult for that in the past. I think there is generally a way forward, though, that in terms of the sort of growing division of labour between NATO and also the European Union, that the European Union as a sort of economic powerhouse, that's actually where a lot of the economies of scale are going to be realised. So I think one of the main outputs of this review is also going to have to be in line with the foreign policy of this, to say, well, how can the UK and the EU cooperate on these matters as a sort of pan-European adventure, noting the fact that, what the US might be able to supply or commit to Europe may change over the next sort of administration, or even, 2 administrations hence.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that Trump is an isolationist. His pick now of his vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance, he has talked about the UK being governed by Islamists. I mean, however you take that comment, what do you think a Trump 2.0, maybe a return of President Trump to the White House might mean for Britain's defences? You've sort of hinted at that.
I think it would probably have to increase significantly, and it would probably have to increase significantly across the board. And that, again, from a financial perspective, will be very, very challenging, because support to Ukraine is effectively within the overall defence spend of the UK, and that's the way NATO really sees this. It's not aid to Ukraine; it's an investment in Ukraine's defence, because Ukraine are ultimately combating Russian forces within Ukraine, so that they also can't challenge conventionally NATO forces on the homeland. But it's going to be very, very challenging for that, where to spend that money, because the more that goes to Ukraine, the less you're then spending on re-equipping and modernising your own forces.
Keir Starmer has described the UK military as hollowed out. This after a string, frankly, of warnings from people like the former Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, who talked about, moving from a post-war to a pre-war world. The General, Sir Patrick Sanders, who's the outgoing Chief of the General Staff, recently talked about Britain needing to train and equip a, quote, citizen army. And that was met with, I think, some scepticism, some kind of shock. Voters have just been to the polls. Do you think that they have absorbed this message around defence spending, around the concerns that there are?
I don't think fully, and although there was efforts by the previous Conservative government to really make the election on security, I don't think it fully materialised in that way. But I do think that just overall now, partly due to the war in Ukraine, but also what's happening between Israel and Hamas, I think the public at large are sort of more focused in on defence as a policy area versus other areas. But I think the government really needs to increase its communication to wider society and really sort of make that argument for why more defence spending in this type of environment is absolutely critical. And I suppose it's the fundamental question for the Strategic Defence Review, is using defence intelligence and the wider UK intelligence community to make an assessment of when it is likely that the UK is going to be potentially engaged in large-scale war with Russia. Because if you do that analysis and it's 2027, well, then that sets the priorities and also your time frame and the level of urgency required. If it's, say, 2033, then that would inform a different way of doing it. You might be able to do it more gradually and more modest. But I think that's actually really important to both sell to the Treasury in terms of the funding aspect, but also to say to wider society, we do need to be prepared for this. Because I agree with the assessments of previous people that it's not necessarily the militaries that win war, it's societies, and they really need to be engaged within this process. It can't just be a sort of Whitehall policy process. It has to engage more widely than that.
So many challenges. Ed, great to get your thoughts. That's Ed Arnold, Senior Research Fellow in European Security at RUSI, the think tank, the Royal United Services Institute. It seems to me, Caroline, there's two parts to this, really. There's the outward-facing review, and those threats have been changing over the years, but there's also the internal review about the way that the MOD operates. And it seems like a lot of those challenges have just been going on for years and years and just haven't been fixed.
Yeah, but I think, we all know that we're in a more unstable world. It's just, how critical that becomes. I think quite eye-opening, really, to speak to RUSI and understand what the threats are. Very interesting to have Ed Arnold on the programme with us. Look, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. You can give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Grostamaki. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.